So much insight to get from our next guest. He's our regular guest. Alexander Downer, the longest-serving foreign minister this country has had. He joins us now from Melbourne. Good to talk to you again, Alexander. I'm fascinated by what you've had to say about the nuclear submarines project. Clearly, nuclear submarines are the best vessels of their type. They have been for 50 years or more. So it's a good thing for Australia's defence outlook if we can have them. But you're saying it would be madness for us to pretend that we can build them in Adelaide or anywhere else in Australia, because that just won't ever happen. Do you believe it's that difficult that it would never actually come to fruition?
It's not only difficult that it will lead to substantial delays, and the cost of doing so in Australia is just prohibitive. It's going to be much cheaper and much quicker to get the submarines built either in the US or the UK. In the short term, we're going to buy from the US 3 or so Virginia-class nuclear submarines. In the medium term, we should just be part of the production line of the US and the UK for their next generation of submarines. But to build them in Australia is going to be very complex, very expensive, and cause huge delays. This is about providing a contribution by Australia to the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. It's not about industry subsidies for South Australia or wherever it may be.
I'll come back to that aspect in a moment, but when it comes to delays and costs, it's not just about the cost. That's not the only downside of delays, is it? There's a real capability gap, and the sooner we get the submarines, the better for us and our allies.
Well, that's right. I mean, not only do we have first and foremost an obligation to have the capacity to defend Australia, but our Defence Force makes a very substantial contribution to what we need to keep the Indo-Pacific region peaceful and secure, and that is having an appropriate balance of power with China. You can't expect the Americans to do all of this on their own. They have to do it in concert with their allies, and we in Japan are their two best allies in the Indo-Pacific region, and we've got to make a contribution. So that includes having an effective submarine force. Nuclear submarines, all the better. But, you know, if it's going to take 30 years or 25 years to build a new generation of submarines and cost hundreds of billions of dollars, that's just absurd. I mean, it's not making a contribution to the regional power balance.
Now, when you warn about this being used for industry policy, that's about economic boost for South Australia and other parts of the country too, by extension, by some parts of the project, presumably. It's also about votes in a political world. It was proposed by your own party, of course, initially. It was delivered by, the AUKUS agreement was delivered by the Liberals under Scott Morrison. It's supported by Labor. Are you telling us that both major parties are dealing with this issue in a political way rather than having the priority driven by national security?
Of course they are. I mean, in the shortish term, both political parties agree that we should buy Virginia-class submarines from the Americans, 3 or so, 3 with an option of up to 5 Virginia-class submarines from the Americans. That's going to be very sensible and very helpful. But both political parties have gone for the pork barrel when it's come to, and the votes, when it's come to South Australia, you know, down the track. I mean, the current Prime Minister and the current Leader of the Opposition won't be involved in politics anymore when this all comes to fruition. Some future government is going to have to make the hard decision to make sure these submarines are built overseas so we get them on time and we get them quickly and for the least possible cost. And if South Australia needs some sort of compensation of some kind, well, some future government might like to provide that compensation. But this particular scheme, it's just pork barrelling at its worst. And it's a promise of something that will never happen, frankly. It's like the second coming. It sounds great, but gosh, I'm not quite sure when that's going to happen either.
It's extraordinary how much of politics at the moment is driven by these promises that nobody is going to be able to deliver. Net zero by 2050 being the other obvious one. None of them will be in Parliament when we fail to meet those targets. Let me get you back to the Middle East and your thoughts on the latest developments. And let's get into it by having a listen to what one of these egregious Hamas leaders has said about their absolute dedication to destroying Israel.
دولة لا مقام لها على أرضنا. إحنا الدولة لابد أن نزيلها لأنه بالفعل هي تعتبر كارثة أمنية وعسكرية وسياسية للأمة العربية والإسلامية، يجب أن تنتهي. لذلك احنا لا نخجل من نقول ذلك بكل قوة، إنه إسرائيل لازم نأدبها وحنأدبها مرة ثانية وثالثة، ومش هذا حتكون طوفان الأقصى أول مرة، لا حتكون ثانية وثالثة ورابعة، لأنه احنا لدينا إصرار ولدينا قرار ولدينا إمكانيات أن نقاتل ونحارب.
Yeah, anybody in any doubts about this is what one of their leaders, Alexander Downer, is prepared to say publicly, prepared to say that those terrorist atrocities we saw on October the 7th, they're happy to inflict again and again and again if necessary to eradicate Israel. It is sickening.
Yeah, and it's really important the West understand this. The standards that a lot of Western politicians, and particularly the demonstrators and elements of the media, apply to the Israeli Defense Force, they don't seem to apply to anyone else in the world. I mean, the Israelis have been, if I may say so, the Jewish people have been attacked in the most brutal and egregious of ways. It is inevitable they are going to react to this. Hamas, which wants to eliminate the Jews, and as they're making perfectly clear, it's not as though they're looking for a two-state solution or some negotiated position with the Israelis. They just want to eliminate them. They are using their own civilians as human shields, understand that. And so they're using schools and they're using hospitals. We've seen the so-called, what are described as refugee camps, as bases, military bases. They're firing missiles from these places. This is the most brutal of people, and they have to be eliminated. Israel has to win the war, and we have to be clear-eyed about the importance of Israel winning this.
We absolutely do. And just on that, I want to show you some of what Penny Wong said today and get your critique on that. Here's the Foreign Minister today.
All of these challenges do not lessen Israel's obligation to observe international law and the rules of war. Even in war, there are rules. And I again would make this point. The international community will not accept ongoing civilian deaths. So when Israel's friends urge Israel to exercise restraint, when Israel's friends urge Israel to protect civilian lives, it is critical that Israel listens.
Why do we hear more warnings directed at Israel than we do pleas for the hostages to be released?
The hostages released, and Hamas are firing rockets at Israeli civilian targets. They're not firing rockets at military targets. They're firing them at randomly at civilian targets in Israel, as are Hezbollah. I mean, I'm not sure that that's consistent with international law, is it? I mean, you've got Western politicians like Penny Wong, who's actually trying to balance the sensitivities within the Labour Party between keeping the Jewish community happy on the one hand and keeping, pro-Palestinian elements in the Labour Party happy on the other. I mean, that's what it's all about. They should be making a simple moral case here, which is that Israel is a country that applies the rule of law, including the rule of international law. For Hamas, there is no law. For Hezbollah, there is no law. For the Iranians who back them, there is no law. They just randomly kill and try to kill. There's no discussion about them meeting international legal standards, as there apparently always is with the Israelis. I mean, I think it's a bit outrageous, really. I think, the Israelis are always put under pressure here. to fight a war with their hands, with one hand tied behind their backs. It's totally unfair.
And they're the ones still burying their dead and still trying to get the hostages back. It is terrible. Thanks for joining us, Alexander Downer. I appreciate it.